Infanta Margarita Teresa, the golden girl from Minana's painting, was doomed even before her birth. She became a victim of a monstrous genetic experiment of the Habsburg dynasty, where purity of blood was more important than human life, and incest became the official policy of the crown. In this video, we unmask the royal majesty. You will find out why Margarita's parents were uncle and niece. How doctors prepared her body to produce heirs from the age of 10 and why was she married to her own uncle, Emperor Leopold of Piara. This is not a princess tale. It is a tragic chronicle of degeneration, and indeed of dynastic madness, that destroyed Europe's most powerful empire from within. To understand the full horror of Margarita's fate, one must realize the world into which she was born. It was a world where biology was perverted for the sake of politics. The Habsburgs, rulers of Spain and Austria, built their empire for centuries on one simple and, as it turned out, fatal principle: let others fight, but you, happy Austria, marry. But by the 15th century, this strategy had become a suicidal loop. Fearing the erosion of their possessions and the transfer of lands to outsiders, they closed the circle of reproduction on themselves. The Habsburg family tree no longer resembled a branched tree. It was a rotten bush whose roots were strangling themselves. Margaret Teresa was the culmination of this madness. She was born on July 12, 1651 in Madrid, in the very same royal alcazar that would become her golden cage. Her genetic map was a complete disaster. Her father, King Philip I, already carried the burden of generations of incest. But her mother, Mary Anne of Austria, was not just the king's wife, she was his own niece, the daughter of his own sister. Imagine the level of genetic interweaving. Grandmothers and grandfathers were simultaneously aunts and uncles, and the blood flowing in little Margarita's veins was so thick with family ties that it contradicted the very laws of nature. Margarita's inbreeding coefficient was higher than if she had been born to a brother and sister. In any other non-royal house, this would be called a crime against nature. But in the dark corridors of the Spanish court it was called a state necessity. Doctors and advisors saw the consequences clearly. They saw the protruding Habsburg jaw, which made it difficult for the kings to chew and speak. They saw hydrocephalus, epilepsy, early deaths of infants. Margarita's brothers died one after another, barely having time to be born. But no one dared to tell the king that his seed was cursed. Instead, they invented a myth of divine purity, claiming that the mixing of royal blood with that of lesser nobles was a sin and that incest was a sacred sacrifice. Margaret survived where others died, and this made her not just a child, but the crown's most valuable asset. Philip IV, an aging and tired monarch, looked at his daughter not with paternal tenderness, but with a calculator in his eyes. The Spanish Empire was bursting at the seams. The economy was collapsing, the army was suffering defeat, and Philip needed an ally, an ironclad ally. And the only way to get it was to sell Margarita back into the same genetic funnel from which she came. Her fate was sealed before she could even speak. She was being groomed to be the wife of her own uncle, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I. Think about it. The girl with the Velázquez painting, this fragile figure in a huge crinoline, was marked as the property of Austria from birth. Her childhood was not her own. Every step she took, every breath she took, every lesson she taught, it was all an investment in a future deal. While she was playing with her ladies-in-waiting and posing for the artist, ministers were already discussing how fertile her womb would be and how soon she could begin bearing heirs for another aging Habsburg. This was not a fairy tale about a princess, it was a story about how a living person is turned into an incubator for the preservation of power, which has long been rotten from the inside. And the worst thing was that Margarita, being an intelligent and perceptive child, began to understand this too early. If you're already shocked by the fact that this girl's parents were uncle and niece, wait until you find out who she was forced to marry and what horrific instructions the doctors gave her. Subscribe to the channel right now, so you don't miss the continuation of this dark story. And write in the comments whether you think Velázquez knew about the tragedy that awaited this girl when he painted her portrait. Margarita Teresa's childhood was spent in the sterile, stifling atmosphere of Spanish etiquette. The 15th century Madrid court was perhaps the most formalized and rigid place on earth. Here, emotions were considered a weakness and spontaneity a sin. The little infanta was raised like a porcelain doll that could not be broken until it was handed over to the buyer. She was never left alone, never allowed to run or play with children of ignoble origin. Her world was limited by the walls of the palace, heavy velvet curtains and endless religious rituals. Margarita's education was carefully planned, but extremely one-sided. She didn't need to know history or philosophy. She didn't need to learn how to govern a state. She was prepared for one role, the role of a submissive wife and mother. But since her future husband, Emperor Leopold, ruled in Vienna, the emphasis was on languages and art. The girl turned out to be surprisingly talented. She quickly mastered Latin and German, played musical instruments and showed a keen interest in the theater. These were glimpses of a living, vibrant soul, which tried to break through the concrete slab of the protocol. But her every talent was seen by the courtiers only as a way to increase her market value. A charming princess is worth more than a boring one. Meanwhile, behind the closed doors of the royal chambers, something much more sinister was happening. From the age of 10, Margarita began to be subjected to humiliating medical examinations. Doctors, armed with knowledge of medieval medicine and fanatical devotion to the crown, examined the girl not to treat her childhood illnesses, but to assess her reproductive fitness. The reports of these doctors, preserved in the archives, read like the documentation of veterinarians evaluating a breeding mare. They described the width of her pelvis, the development of her breasts, the onset of her menstrual cycle. It all came down to one question: when would she be able to give birth? There was not a word in these reports about her feelings, her fears, or her soul. It was a set of biological functions. The Spanish court was in a hurry, King Philip was weakening, and he needed to secure an alliance with Austria as quickly as possible. But Leopold, her fiancé and uncle, was not sitting idle either. Vienna eagerly awaited the portraits of the Infanta that Velázquez sent every few years. These paintings, which we today consider masterpieces of art, were in fact photo reports of the bride's growth. Leopold and his advisors examined them under a magnifying glass, trying to discern signs of disease or degeneration. They were looking for that very Habsburg jaw. They were looking for signs of dementia. The irony was that they were looking for these signs in order to continue the very practice that created them. The marriage negotiations were brutal and cynical. Spain was bankrupt, but Vienna demanded a colossal dowry. 500,000 gold ducats is an unthinkable sum for a ruined country. But Philip IV was willing to pay. He literally sold the future of his country and the life of his daughter for the sake of illusory stability. In the marriage contract, signed when Margarita was only 12 years old, her rights were completely ignored. She had to renounce her rights to the Spanish throne in exchange for the promise that her children would become heirs to the empire. It was a deal sealed with blood and gold. Margarita herself lived in a state of quiet horror all this time. She knew what awaited her. She knew that she would have to leave sunny Madrid, her father's home, whom she loved despite everything, and go to cold, distant Vienna to a man who was 11 years older than her and whom she had only seen in portraits. She knew that her sisters, married under the same rules, often died young. Fear can be seen even in the late portraits by Velázquez and his students. Look at her face at the age of 14. The childish puffiness had gone, giving way to an expression of deep melancholy and resignation to fate. She was dressed in mourning colors even before she died. In April 1666 a proxy wedding took place. It was a surreal ceremony where the groom was not present. His role was played by the ambassador. Margarita stood at the altar, a 15-year-old girl, wrapped in heavy brocade and diamonds, and pronounced vows of allegiance to an empty place. From that moment on, it no longer belonged to Spain. She became Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, property of the Habsburgs, and the clocks of her life began to count down. The courtiers rejoiced, the cannons fired salutes, and the people shouted greetings. But at the center of all this noise stood a lonely child, sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambitions. Margarita Teresa's journey from Madrid to Vienna was not just a move, but a grandiose spectacle that stretched on for months. It was a show of force that no longer really existed. The Infanta's cortege resembled a mobile home, hundreds of carriages, thousands of soldiers, servants, cooks, priests and, of course, doctors. Spain, bleeding and destitute, spent its last resources to send its princess to Austria with the pomp worthy of a goddess. But for Margarita herself, this was the path to the scaffold. Every kilometer took her further from the only world she knew and closer to the unknown. During stops in Italian cities, it was put on display. Local nobility, diplomats, and common people flocked to gaze at the Spanish doll. Chronicles of those years describe her as incredibly pale, withdrawn and silent. She carried out her representative functions with the mechanical precision of an automaton, smiling when required, extending her hand for a kiss, nodding at greetings in foreign languages. But in her eyes, as some astute observers noted, one could read mortal melancholy. She was a hostage in a golden carriage being taken to her master. Emperor Leopold, who was waiting for her in Vienna, was a complex figure. He was deeply religious, educated, loved music, but he was also a product of the same crippled genetics. Contemporaries described his appearance without embellishment. He had an extremely pronounced Habsburg jaw. His lower lip hung down so much that it was difficult for him to speak, and his mouth always remained half open. He was short in stature, with thin legs and a large nose. For a 15-year-old girl raised on idealized portraits, the encounter with reality must have been a shock. And this man was not just her husband, he was her uncle, her mother's brother. The arrival in Vienna in the winter of 1666 was arranged with incredible luxury. Vienna wanted to show that it was superior to Madrid. Fireworks, triumphal arches, operas written especially in her honor. Leopold greeted her with respect. They say that he sincerely fell in love with her portrait and, seeing her in person, was enchanted. He called it my only joy. But behind these sentimental words lay a harsh pragmatism. He didn't need joy, he needed a mother. His previous wife had already died without leaving an heir, and the entire empire was looking at Margarita's belly even before they entered the bedroom. The second real wedding took place on December 12, 166. And immediately after the fanfares died down and the last pieces of the birthday cake were eaten, the hell of everyday life began for Margarita. The Viennese court hated her. Even though she was a Habsburg, she was Spanish. The Austrian courtiers despised the Spanish stiffness, their strict black clothes and rigid etiquette. Margarita could not speak German fluently. Her accent was ridiculed. Her retinue, who had come with her from Madrid, was driven out of the palace by intrigues. She found herself in complete isolation. Imagine this level of loneliness. You are 15 years old. You are in a foreign country where the climate is harsh and cold. Your husband is your uncle, who is busy with state affairs and hunting. The ladies of the court whisper behind your back, discussing your every move. And the only task you are given is to get pregnant. The pressure was colossal. Every morning began with the doctors asking about her cycle. Every evening ended with a prayer for my son. Margarita Teresa had no right to adapt, to grow up, to make mistakes. She was thrown into the icy waters of adulthood and dynastic responsibility without a lifeline. And the girl's body, fragile and weakened by genetic defects, began to fail. The first pregnancy occurred almost immediately, in early 1667, just 3 months after the wedding. The courtyard rejoiced. Leopold was happy, but no one thought that the body of a 15-year-old girl, itself the fruit of incest, was simply not ready to bear a healthy child. It was the beginning of a nightmarish cycle that would turn the remaining years of her short life into an endless torture of hope and pain. Life at the Viennese court turned into an endless medical experiment for Margaret. The first pregnancy was difficult. The Infanta suffered from toxicosis, weakness, and constant bleeding. But instead of peace and care, she received treatment according to 10th century standards. Doctors bled her, believing that this would balance the humors. She was forced to drink decoctions of crushed precious stones and animal parts, and to believe in the power of the holy relics that were placed around her bed. It was obscurantism disguised as science, and it was slowly killing both her and the child. In 167 the first tragedy occurred. Margaret gave birth to a son, Ferdinand Wenceslas. The joy was boundless. At last an heir, a boy who will unite the crowns. But the joy did not last long. The child was weak, sickly, living proof of the degeneration of the race. He lived less than a year. His death became the first crushing blow to Margarita's psyche. She blamed herself. Religion and her environment taught her that the death of a child is a punishment for sins or lack of piety. No one told her, "It's not your fault. It's the fault of your ancestors who mixed blood for centuries." Instead of giving her time to mourn her son and recover, the machine demanded to continue. The empire needs an heir. This slogan sounded in Margaret's ears louder than funeral bells. Leopold, although he grieved, dutifully fulfilled his duty. The couple's sex life was devoid of romance. It was a bureaucratic procedure for conception. Margaret became pregnant again, and again and again her body turned into a battlefield. The second pregnancy ended in miscarriage. The third brought a daughter, Maria Antonia, Margaret's only child who would outlive her. But the birth of a girl was perceived by the court as a failure. Just a daughter, they whispered in the corridors. A girl could not inherit the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. The pressure increased. Margaret was accused of being incapable of giving birth to a healthy boy. Her haters at court, especially Leopold's stepmother, openly called her defective. This persecution took place against the backdrop of the empress's appalling physical condition. Due to repeated pregnancies, she developed a goiter, an enlargement of the thyroid gland, a common occurrence at the time, but in hers it took on pathological forms. She gained weight, losing her former beauty. Her face became puffy and pale. Her golden hair faded. The same radiant girl from the Velázquez painting disappeared, dissolved in pain and humiliation. She barely left her bed, suffering from depression and chronic fatigue. But the doctors were relentless. They forbade her fresh air, fearing bad winds. They kept her in stuffy, darkened rooms that smelled of palm and medicine. And worst of all, they continued to insist on new attempts. The fourth pregnancy. Fifth. Each one took a piece of her life. Margaret suffered miscarriages one after another. Each time it was accompanied by physical agony and blood loss, which brought her to the brink of death. But as soon as she came to, the cycle started over again. She wrote letters to Spain, full of longing and despair, but the answers were cold. Her father was dead, her sickly brother Charles II sat on the throne, enchanted, himself a living corpse. Spain had no time for her. She was alone in icy Vienna, surrounded by people who saw in her only a broken mechanism. By the age of 20, Margaret Teresa looked like a very old woman. Her body was exhausted to the limit. But the dynastic greed of the Habsburgs knew no mercy. They needed a boy. At any cost. And that price was the life of a mother. By the winter of 1672, Margaret Teresa was already a shadow of her former self. She was pregnant again for the 6th time in 6 years of marriage. Think about that number. 6 pregnancies by the age of 21. And her health had been undermined by inbreeding from the start. It was a death sentence, and she knew it. The doctors surrounding her bed no longer radiated confidence. Now their eyes were filled with fear. They saw that the Empress's body's resources were completely exhausted. Her heart, her lungs, her blood were all failing. Winter in Vienna is especially harsh. Drafts blew through the vast halls of the Habsburg, but Margaret was shivering not from the cold, but from the fever. She suffered from bronchitis, which developed into pneumonia due to pregnancy. Every breath was painful for her, but even in this state, the protocol did not weaken. Priests crowded around her bed, urging her to pray for a healthy future. As if her own life was secondary. Leopold spent time at her bedside, praying, crying, but he could not stop the mechanism that had been set in motion. He was as much a prisoner of the system as she was. It was just that his role was that of an overseer, and hers that of a victim. In March 1673 she went into premature labor. It was an agony that lasted for several hours. Margaret Teresa, Holy Roman Empress, Infanta of Spain, died in blood and agony, trying to push out of herself another life that was doomed to die. The child, a girl, died almost immediately. Margaret did not survive her for long. On March 12, 1673, her heart stopped beating. She was only 21 years old. The story that began in the golden rays of the Spanish sun on the canvas of a great master ended in the grey, cold gloom of a Viennese bedroom. The murder was finished. The system squeezed everything it could out of her, and threw away the empty shell. But the most cynical thing happened right after her death. Hardly had Margaret's body cooled down, hardly had the first funeral prayers ceased, when the court advisors began discussing a new bride for the emperor. No mourning for politics. The empire still needed an heir. Leopold, an inconsolable widower, would marry again in just a few months, and again to his relative. The wheel of incest continued to turn, grinding new lives, not noticing the loss of one little Spanish princess. Vienna held a lavish funeral. Margaret was placed in the imperial crypt in the Capuchin church, next to the very ancestors whose obsession with the purity of blood killed her. Her death became no lesson. No one said, enough. No one admitted that marriages between uncles and nieces are the way to abyss. On the contrary, Margaret's death was used as a pretext for a new political game, accusing Spanish doctors of incompetence and the Spanish climate of the princess's effeminacy. The true cause, a genetic curse and barbaric treatment of women, was carefully swept under the carpet of history. Think about it for a second. Do you consider the doctors and priests who pushed her into these pregnancies, knowing she was dying, accomplices to murder, or were they simply fulfilling their duty to the crown? Share your opinion in the comments, it's important. The death of Margaret Teresa on March 12, 1673, was more than just the cardiac arrest of one exhausted young woman. It was the snapping of a string that held together the entire structure of European equilibrium. On that cold Viennese night, as the candles at her deathbed burned out, a silence hung in the air that was more terrible than any scream. 21 years. It took only 21 years. The Habsburgs, to cultivate, exploit, and destroy the perfect symbol of their greatness. But what followed her death transformed this personal tragedy into a historical catastrophe of planetary proportions. The cynicism of the system revealed itself instantly, even before the empress's body had cooled. Leopold I, the emperor who, according to eyewitnesses, sincerely loved his only joy and spent hours in prayer at her bedside, found himself powerless before the ruthless logic of the dynasty. His grief was real, but his actions were dictated not by the heart, but by the imperative of state. The empire needed a male heir. Margaret failed this task. From the point of view of political mechanics, she was a broken instrument that needed immediate replacement. While Vienna plunged into official mourning, and requiem masses were being held in churches. In the secret offices of the Habsburg, advisors were already drawing up lists of new brides. It was a betrayal of memory, carried out with the cold efficiency of a bureaucratic machine. Just a few months after the funeral, Leopold would marry again, to Claudia Felicia of Austria, his second cousin, and the wheel of incest creaked, turned, and continued its deadly rotation, oblivious to the loss of one human soul. Margaret was buried in the imperial crypt of the Capuchin church in Vienna. Her lead coffin took its place in a long row of other metal boxes, hiding the remains of those who for centuries played God with genetics. But if her body found peace, her legacy turned into a poison that slowly began to kill the last of her family's power. Margaret's death severed the living link between Vienna and Madrid. The very bond for which she was sent on this deadly journey disappeared. Spain was left alone, face to face with its internal decay and external enemies. To understand the full scale of the catastrophe that she had been preventing to understand Margarita's existence, we need to look at what was happening in her homeland, Spain. While Margarita was dying in childbirth in Vienna, her brother, Charles II, sat on the Spanish throne. If Margarita was the tragic beauty of degeneration, Charles was its monstrous reality. History has nicknamed him El Hechizada, the Enchanted One. But it wasn't witchcraft, it was genetics. Charles's inbreeding coefficient was 0.254, higher than that of children born from a relationship between brother and sister. He was a living anatomical manual on the consequences of incest. While Margarita's portraits hid the truth behind a blaze of color, Charles could hide nothing. His lower jaw jutted out so much that his teeth wouldn't close, and he couldn't chew his food properly, swallowing chunks whole. His tongue was too large for his mouth, so his speech was an incoherent mumble, which only a few close servants understood. He could not walk until he was 6 years old. His bones were fragile as glass, and his mind remained forever in the twilight of infantilism. He suffered from epilepsy, migraines, constant diarrhea, and premature aging. By the age of 30, he looked like a deep old man. This was the same king for whose power they had sacrificed Margarita. The contrast between brother and sister was terrifying. Margarita, shining through the centuries thanks to Velázquez, and Charles, frightening with his ugliness. But, in essence, they were two sides of the same coin. They were both victims of the same criminal arrogance of their ancestors. The only difference was that Margarita was killed by reproductive exploitation, and Charles was killed by life itself, every moment of which was torment for him. The most terrible irony was that all these victims were in vain. Charles II, despite 2 marriages, was sterile. Nature put a fat end to the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs. An autopsy performed after his death in 1700 shocked doctors. The report stated, there was not a drop of blood in his body. The heart was the size of a peppercorn, the lungs were corroded, the intestines were rotten and gangrenous, one egg was black as coal, and the head was full of water. It was the physical embodiment of the collapse of the empire. With the last breath of Margaret's brother, an era came to an end in which the sun never set over the Spanish dominions. Charles's death without heirs triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 15th century. Europe plunged into chaos for 12 years. France, Austria, England, and Holland tore apart the body of the dying empire. Millions of people died on the battlefield. Cities were destroyed, economies were devastated. And in the center of this hurricane of death, the shadow of Margaret Teresa was invisibly present. If she had survived, if she had given birth to a healthy son who could have claimed the Spanish throne, the history of the world would have taken a different course. But the genetic dead end into which the Habsburgs had driven themselves left no options. The blood of millions of soldiers who died in this war is also the price for the purity of blood that Margarita's parents so zealously guarded. But the tragedy was not limited to big politics. There was another act of personal drama that is often forgotten. Margarita was survived by her daughter Maria Antonia, the only child who survived her mother. It would seem that fate should have spared the orphan, but the dynasty's Malog demanded new victims. Maria Antonia was intelligent and educated, like her mother, but she inherited the curse of her family. The same concentrated Habsburg blood flowed through her. Her fate became a mirror image of her mother's fate. It was as if the evil horn had decided to repeat its scenario. Maria Antonia was married at the age of 15 to the Elector of Bavaria Maximilian II and Emmanuel. It was again a political marriage, designed to cement alliances. And the race for heirs began again. Maria Antonia, like Margaret, found herself locked in a cycle of pregnancy and loss. Her health and fragile rebirth could not withstand it. She died in 1692 at the age of 23. She lived only 2 years longer than her mother. The saddest thing in the story of Maria Antonia is the fate of her son Joseph Ferdinand. This boy was the last hope. He was the grandson of Margaret Therese and the great-grandson of Philip Eppie. At the end of the 15th century, when it became clear that Charles II would die childless, it was Joseph Ferdinand who was considered the main contender for the Spanish throne. It seemed that through Margaret's descendants justice would triumph and the crown would return to her family. The boy was healthy, active, and showed no visible signs of degeneration. The European powers even agreed to recognize him as heir in order to avoid war. But the curse of the Habsburgs knew how to wait. In 1699, at the age of 6, Joseph Ferdinand died suddenly. Officially cat spawn, but there were rumors of poison. With his death, the last chance for a peaceful transfer of power disappeared. The line of Margaret Teresa was broken once and for all. Now, looking back a century later, we see the whole story, and it is terrifying in its senselessness. Generation of incest, hundreds of crippled destinies, deaths of infants, torments of mothers, millions killed in wars. And all this for what? For the sake of emptiness, for the sake of a dynasty that ate itself. But this dark story has one bright, albeit painful, ray of light. This is art. The way we remember Margarita Teresa today is a phenomenon without parallel. She did not become a great ruler, she did not perform any feats, but her face is one of the most recognizable in the history of mankind. Diego Velázquez, in his painting Menina, created a miracle that goes beyond the scope of painting. Art historians have been arguing about the mystery of the Menins for centuries. Who's looking at whom? The artist is looking at us, we are looking at the Infanta. Or the Infanta looks at her parents, who are reflected in the mirror behind her. But if we put aside the theory of composition and look at the essence, then the Menins are a psychological portrait of loneliness. Take a close look at Margarita's surroundings. Dwarves, dogs, ladies-in-waiting, Neftiani monks. This is the courtyard, which is her world, but at the same time her prison. In the center of this strange circus of births and hypocrites stands a small shining child. Velázquez didn't just paint the dress and face, he captured the aura of doom. There is something mystical in her gaze in this painting. She looks straight into the eyes of the viewer through centuries, through borders, through death. There is no childish carelessness in this look. There is in it the wisdom of a being that knows that it is only an object. It's as if she's asking us, do you see me? Not the dress, not the title, but me. Velázquez, who loved this girl as his own daughter, painted her from birth until his death, managed to convey the tragedy of a stolen identity. He documented a crime that was committed in plain sight, but which no one dared to call a crime. Velázquez's paintings became a kind of posthumous justification for Margarita. History has erased the names of the ministers who traded in her body. We have forgotten the names of the doctors who tortured her with bloodletting. Even the mighty Leopold I remained in history only as a dry article in an encyclopedia. But Margarita is alive. She is alive in every museum, in every art textbook, in every glance of a tourist who stops in front of her portrait in Prada or in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. This transformation of the victim into an icon is the highest form of historical justice. The Habsburgs viewed it as a biological container for the transmission of genes. They denied her the right to be an individual, but art gave her back that right. Today we mourn her not as a lost political asset, but as a person. We sympathize with the girl who was deprived of her childhood. We sympathize with the woman who was deprived of her life. Modern science, having analyzed the DNA of the remains of the Habsburgs, has made a final verdict: the dynasty fell not because of enemies, but because of its own pride. Genetic analysis confirmed that the level of homozygosity, the heritability of identical genes, in the last Spanish Habsburgs was incompatible with the survival of the population. They literally bred a breed of people incapable of life. Margaret Therese, her brother Karl, her children. Yes, they were all hostages of a biological dead end. This is a lesson to humanity that the laws of nature cannot be broken with impunity, no matter how blue your blood. As I finish the story of Margaret Teresa, it is impossible not to feel a heaviness in my heart. Her life was a brief flash in the endless night of history. But it is precisely stories like these that force us to rethink the very concept of power and success. What is the greatness of an empire if it is built on the bones of its own children? Is absolute power worth turning a family into an incubator of monsters? Margaret Teresa of Spain, Holy Roman Empress, Archduchess of Austria. All these titles crumbled to dust, but the girl in the white dress with golden hair remained. She stands in the center of the hall, illuminated by the eternal light of Velázquez's genius, and looks at us. Now she is free. Free from marriage contracts, free from doctors, free from pain, and free from that terrible debt that killed her. And as long as we remember her story, as long as we are able to be horrified by her fate and admire her image, she will not disappear into oblivion. It was a story about how power devours its children. A story written in blood on the canvas of eternity. Let the memory of Margaret Teresa be a reminder of the value of every human life, which must always, absolutely always, be above any political ambitions. Sleep well, little Infanta. Your watch is over. You would be afraid to live in a world where your fate is planned down to the minute and your body belongs to the state. The story of Margaret Teresa is just one chapter in the Black Book of Royal History. If this story touched you, if you felt the cold breath of history, do not leave silently. Subscribe to the channel right now. We dig up the graves of the past to uncover the truth that has been hidden for centuries. Click the bell to stay informed about the next investigation. Believe me, there will be even more secrets. And write in the comments what you think. Is Menina's painting a curse or a blessing for Margarita's memory? Did she make her immortal or lock her in that room forever? I read every comment you make. M.